You have to lead by example. If you are telling people you want them to come into the office for collaboration and that's the organization you want to go, there's a trade-off you're making, right? There's a talent pool you're limiting yourself to.
Insured Nomads proudly supports the New Nomad podcast. Insured Nomads for the evolution of insurance, for the revolution of travel. For all your travel, medical, and support needs, please visit our website at insurednomads.com. We support our location-independent community worldwide.
Welcome to the New Nomad podcast, hosted by Alan and Andrew of Insured Nomads. Join us as Alan and Andrew interview and explore the community of people and ideas that embody the nomadic spirit. Tune in to incredible discussions with thought leaders each week that will help you take full advantage of the cross-border remote work lifestyle. Now here are your hosts.
To another episode of the New Nomad podcast. Really excited to have our guest today. Q Hamirani is joining us, and also a special treat, Brett Estep is joining me as my co-host. I know for some of you listeners out there, it's been a few months since our last podcast. We've been exploring AI, the future of work, digital nomadism. There's a whole pile of issues. We thought it'd be good to take a little bit of a break and pick it back up. And I know, Brett, you've been in the fray. Future of work's on the top of everyone's mind. Your thoughts?
Alan, good to be back. It's good to have the New Nomad podcast back, and congrats on the continued success with this publication. It's funny you bring up AI because as we continue to look and support the modern employer and the future of work, I was a bit surprised at the traction that this artificial intelligence has, actually gained. Capability of AI right now is both exciting and scary from our perspective. And it's not just in terms of content generation, but the ability for these platforms to support visual, videography, creative, etc. And we at Insured Nomads are actually embracing the AI to a point right now, not to replace any of the human connections or empathy that we've built as a brand, but more importantly, some of the back office, support in our marketing department. And we have recently, as of this week, launched our first AI-powered virtual travel concierge that is now in our native app. And so we're sticking our toe in as I think the industry tries to figure out where to take, platforms like ChatGPT-4, but it's an exciting new era for us. So it's good to be back on your podcast.
It's great. We're going to have some thought leadership today. And Q is a thought leader in the human resources, people management, people leadership space. Just a little bit of a background, and I'll have you introduce yourself a bit better. But I will say this, Q, as somebody who's worked and lived in 10 or more countries, some of the things that you've done on living and work anywhere programs, really unique stuff. I'd love to just have your quick thoughts on what you've seen in the last few years, because it's been a world of change out there, and certainly you're leading a lot of that change.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be on this podcast as well. So I'm Q. I was at Airbnb for 5 years, leading a lot of our programs, including the future of work that ended up becoming our Live and Work Anywhere program. And now, as of over a month now, I'm at this organization called Paper, which is a remote first company as well, and really focusing on the fun and the goods and the bads and the challenges of remote work, because it's not all easy, but it can be good. For me, I think the most interesting part has been the pendulum shift that keeps going back and forth between what is right. Is it remote? Is it hybrid? Is it all in? And I think for me, the big thing has really been a focus on it depends on what is right for an organization. If you're in retail or healthcare, remote work is not an option, probably. It depends on the leadership style of who is leading it. Some leaders are more comfortable being with what they've worked with in the past, which could be either one of those options. So I think the future I think it's across the board, it shifts. However, from my own personal view, I think the future of work is flexibility for the employee, which leads to engagement and productivity. And that is accomplished by letting employees pick what they want. If they want to work remotely and that's best for their environment, they work remotely. If they want to hop around the world and explore different places while they're working, that's their option. If they like going in because they may not have the right work environment or they need a workplace, that could be it. I think it's important to to empower the employee what best for them, versus telling them what they should do because of a leadership style or stigma or a habit that was done for decades before. So that's a little bit, probably a lot to unpack in there, but that's a little bit of my thoughts on. I think it's a little bit all over the place, but I still believe the future of work is flexibility and empowering the employees to do what they.
So, Alan, something that you are all too familiar with is our sensitivity around corporate culture. And one of the things that is so important to us at Insured Nomads is to preserve the culture that we have created. We, 2Q, are a fully remote, fully distributed business. And so I would just be curious as to your thoughts on how do you go about maintaining an effective corporate culture with a distributed or fully remote business?
Yeah, that's to start off. That's the part I was referring to. Is it's not easy, right? You can't just let it be and it'll just happen like you could potentially in a non-remote world pre-pandemic. I think it's twofold. One is I think you have to be very intentional about how you develop and scale your people programs to enable employees to develop and grow and feel supported in a remote world. So what I mean by that is honestly, like it's really rethinking your entire employee value proposition. Are you giving them the right benefits to be flexible in that remote world? Are you giving them the right compensation? Are you aligning your compensation philosophy to align with that? Are you giving them the right learning abilities to be to do what they want while they're remote? So that's one. The other piece I think that is very critical is when I say remote world and flexibility, I don't mean no in-person connection. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think you have to have intentional in-person connections at some point through the year. That could be once a quarter, Brett, for your organization. That could be once a year for another organization. That could be a few offsites over the year. So I think you do still need those moments of in-person connection, almost to like recharge the battery on building, those relationships so you can go off and then do work. Because I think what I've learned, and I think a lot of us have experienced definitely through the pandemic, is you can be productive remotely, right? Like at Airbnb, we had to turn around the company and go IPO all remote without being in an office. You can do it. However, my belief is you cannot strengthen deep relationships remotely completely. So these moments of in-person connection, you build those relationships, you build those human connections, you go off, kind of work asynchronously. Finding the right balance between synchronous and asynchronous work is also an ongoing challenge, I would say, to optimize. But I would say those two, relook at your employee value proposition across the board, benefits being a key one, and then having those intentional in-person moments of connection through the year at the cadence that makes sense. And I'll be curious, Brad, is that kind of something you guys have looked at? Or I know you have folks all around the world, so it's easier said than done, but.
No, as a matter of fact, we are. We are gathering the team together for the first time, admittedly, and I think there's been a lot of constraints, but we're going to get together in Geneva.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, and so I don't disagree with you whatsoever. We are very committed to trying to maintain and preserve that corporate culture. But, I've been in business development and externally facing roles almost my entire career. So to be completely devoid of human connections just doesn't work for me. So we'll keep you posted.
Q, there's also a difference in, people's career progression. So what I hear is many of the younger, newer employees want mentorship. They would like to have, you can still mentor, remotely, but it's a lot more effective to some folks that you see them in the office. I know that's part of the debate. And another part of the debate, here is, well, a lot of the senior leaders, well, they take the summer off and they ride off into the sunset and work remotely from the beaches and the mountains and all the wonderful places. But there's got to be a balance there. And I'm hearing two different stories that it works perfectly for some groups. And I think some of the younger folks who want the mentorship and the support and the growth might be suffering from this. You've worked in different areas. Could you share a little bit of your thoughts on kind of that career progression and mentorship?
Yeah, so I think one is you have to really be intentional about how you're supporting the employees. For some it may be they do better in person with mentoring and coaching. Some may prefer the opposite because they may be able to do it more regularly virtually versus being in. So I think you have to accommodate for both. I think the the tricky part with the whole kind of remote work and kind of where it goes is just kind of making sure that you meet kind of, to your point on some, leaders may say one thing but act differently, right? Like that's the gist of kind of what we're seeing in the media every day with different headlines. I think leadership by example, like again, going back to the basics, right? Like pandemic aside, nomadism aside, like you have to lead by example. If you are telling people you want them to come into the office for collaboration and that's the organization you want to go, there's a trade-off you're making, right? There's a talent pool you're limiting yourself to. There's a bunch of trade-offs you're making that may be okay for how you want to lead and build your organization, but you have to then act in that manner. You have to be there every day. You have to make sure you're driving that collaboration. If you're not, then you have to support the asynchronous ways of growing and developing talent as well. I think where some of this falls flat is where people kind of move too quickly to move with what they hear in the news, and then they don't act and follow along, because eventually I think that's not a sustainable way of doing it. So I would say leaders need to lead by example, pick what they want, and if it doesn't work, be okay to say, okay, we tried this, it didn't work, let's try a different approach and let's get feedback on how it's working with our employees. Because if you don't, one of the things I learned at Airbnb when we built our Live and Work Anywhere program, it was a program we incubated, just the digital nomad program, for 18 months before it became our formal Live and Work Anywhere program. And one of the things we learned was we have to build something that's relatable to our employees. Our employees wanted to live and work anywhere around the world because that's what we do as a business. That's what we host homes around. If we came out and built a program and said, no, we want everyone in the office, we knew right off the bat we were going to not be relatable. So you have to do those trade-offs, and then you have to lead by example. And then you have to stand your ground, at least for a brief bit, try it out, and then iterate towards something else if you want. I think people sometimes don't do that. They just kind of go with the headline, and then they go to what they're comfortable. And I think the flip side of this is also true, right? If you have a remote work culture, you're telling everyone they can work remotely, and then you have a leader coming in every single day, indirectly imposes this pressure on the proximity bias that people will feel by losing out if they don't come in. And then are their careers impacted because they ended up coming in and they were closer to the leader, even though the organization is remote? So there's a lot that leadership by example can help build or not help build. And I think that's critical to leading by example as well.
Q, you touched on a word that is relatively new to us in terms of our strategy, which is asynchronous.
Yeah.
There are pluses and minuses to working in that environment. Do you have any best practices in supporting an async type of work environment?
Yeah, so I think the couple of things that I've learned along the way, and I'm still learning because there's a fine balance between the two, is trying to have dedicated focus time in the day to do asynchronous work. An example I'll give is I have maybe 2 30-minute blocks blocked in the day, one in the first half, one in the second half, to dedicate to asynchronous work. I'll be honest, I don't always get those hours, but I put them on the calendar so that at least if I get 15 minutes of it, or some days both, some days none, it's okay. So I think there's a couple things. One, on a personal note, is having dedicated focus time, because what's happened in this asynchronous Zoom world that we kind of exploded into once the pandemic came was you're in meetings 10 hours, 10 hours a day, and then you just are multitasking. You can't do anything really with a lot of focus. So having dedicated focus time. I think so that's on the individual level is one example. On the organizational level, I think you also got to think through what are the norms you want to set with the organization, right? If you have, for example, say, you have Slack, email, GChat, text messaging, you name 4 other communication apps all running in your organization, it's just chaos all around and adding more to that lack of focus, right? So maybe pick one. Slack is our main, if that's the case, Slack is our main communication channel for async work. Have that as a dedicated space, because I think streamlining how you want to collaborate asynchronously with the right tools can help get there, and then empowering individuals to have some individual focus time are 2 ways I've seen. But honestly, this is something that is going to be a continuous journey, learning. We're trying to look at, at Airbnb as well, we were looking at meeting times, how many people are in meetings for how long. But you got to really unpack that, right? To understand, it's not just bad if you're in meetings 70% of the day. It's what kind of meetings are 20 people meeting for meetings 6 hours a day? Then that's productivity could be, you could flip that into having an agenda, making sure async work can meet a lot of the meeting times or reduction in that. So there's a lot, like we're still figuring it out. But I think those are just top of mind two things on the personal and organizational front that you could check out.
Q, I'm really curious on the Live and Work Anywhere program, what parameters you may have had in place.
Yeah.
Because I get the question all the time, like, well, if we let our people go to a country that we don't have, a corporate entity, we've maybe opened ourselves up for taxes. Did you have things like a pre-approval process where people are going and kind of what parameters and maybe even some cautionary tales or lessons that you might share with our audience if they want to head down this primrose path?
Definitely. So the digital nomad, the nomadism part of our Live and Work Anywhere program, it had four, at a high level. The Live and Work Anywhere program ended up having 4 components. I'll just run through them really quick and then address your question on the nomadism. One was that employees can choose to work out of their home or the office. So they could come in 5 days a week or not. It's their choice. They know what's best for them. So we didn't force one way or the other. The second one was employees can move anywhere within a country of employment and their compensation would not change. This was pretty big in the US and Canada, where location-based tier compensation is the norm, especially in tech. So I could move from my house in the Bay Area to Iowa on a nice farm and make the same money. So that was a big thing, empowering value-based pay. The third one was our nomadism program, which I'll get to the complexities in a second, which was that. And the fourth one was what we alluded to earlier, is having in-person moments of connections to really build those relationships and having a unified roadmap for the organization to anchor to. Because to your point earlier, Brett, when you're asynchronous, a lot of people are doing a lot of good work, but you have to be that much more intentional of making sure they're all aligned, because it's not like you're whiteboarding in an office and you're having those conversations all the time. So coming back to the nomadism piece, that was a program that we actually incubated, to my point earlier, in August of 2020. So the reason I mentioned that is twofold. One is we had like 16 months of basically a research study of how the complexities work. And then we were able to kind of make that our differentiator in our future work program in 2022. The way we had our program back then and even now was basically any employee that wants to go somewhere opens a request, and we invested and stood up a team, which was one of my teams, to basically really do that end-to-end complexity analysis and then help the employee understand that they could go for X duration of time. So time was one limiter, on to your point on what are some of the constraints. The other limiter was they had to have the right work authorization to go to that country. If they didn't have it, we helped them understand that there are about 25 countries so far that have issued remote work visas or digital nomad visas. They could purchase it to break through that barrier. We were also uniquely positioned at Airbnb, where we were influencing policy. So we were driving the adoption of these visas, because that's something we were uniquely positioned to do. And then we would tell the individuals, you can go for X duration. When we launched our big program, so in that incubation 15 months, we literally had teams studying tax treaties between two countries. So if Q wanted to go to country X, we were looking at where was Q's citizenship, where was his employment, can we make it happen? And we would stretch to the treaty limits. In a lot of cases, that was 182 days from a tax implication standpoint. When we rolled out our broader program, we wanted to make it more digestible. We wanted to balance the risk, because yes, there is a tax and tax risk, but there are several other risks. There's employment risk, there is data privacy risk, there's all sorts of risk. And if you're pre-IPO versus public, if you're profitable, if you're not, these risks kind of can change indicator levels on a green to red scale, if you look at it that way. So in our main program, we said to simplify it, anyone can go to any country for up to 90 days only per calendar year. So that severely mitigated. It was a good balance. They still have to have the right work authorization. They still have to open a request with my team, so that in the event, like if they have custom access to data, depending on their type of role, it also changes kind of where you want to go. So that's how we mitigated it. A dedicated team to do it. We studied this for 15 months before we kind of came up with our stance on what do we want to allow this in the future. And then we used work authorization as a prerequisite, and the time and duration spent as a limiting risk mitigator for that as well. And it's 90 days per country per year. So you could be a nomad, you just got to move every quarter, versus some organizations that have chosen to just say 30 days in total per year, kind of don't ask, don't tell, go where you want, just come back in. It's almost like a vacation at that point, right? You go on vacation for 4 weeks a year. It's kind of like with that mindset. So that's how we kind of constrained it and made it digestible, relatable, and yet to the extent making sure that we mitigated our risk, but we still reviewed every single case along the way. If it
Yeah,
changed.
one of the, in my opinion, one of the pillars to a good operation is performance management. And in this environment where you've got people living and working anywhere and potentially in an asynchronous fashion, did you have to make any adjustments to how performance management was conducted?
So I would say with the big adjustment we had to make was really doubling down and being very explicit on our expectations, which again, one would argue is the fundamentals of performance management. But in this asynchronous remote world, it made it even more critical. And we did make some tweaks to your point. So for example, we told anyone that wanted to live and work abroad, in addition to getting the approval from my team to cover the kind of logistical and compliance aspects, they were expected to work on, if they were in the US and they were going abroad, they were expected to work on Pacific Standard Time, which is what all our US stuff was anchored on. So if I want to go to Bali for like 2 months and I had the right approvals and all that to go to, I may not see like sunlight on the weekdays. I'm not doing the time zone right in my head, but that's the choice I'm making. So we had to set some very clear guidelines on, you're expected to work you're expected to work these hours. Your output is going to be, training managers to make sure that the focus was a lot on output as well, because if we didn't see that, we still had to do performance actions on that. In a practical way, it worked out of, somewhere along those lines, because obviously it's nice to say like you have to work on PST, but it's hard to like bring that to light for months. What I did with my team, because I had folks that were traveling around the world, I pitched it as, I want you to be in Pacific Standard Time for 4 hours a day, so that we can have collaboration, we can have our meetings with our cross-functional stakeholders. And it was roughly 4 to 5 hours a day. The rest of the day, figure out when you want to work in your local time to make sure you get your work done, your asynchronous work. And obviously a lot of this depends on the level too, right? Like if someone is relatively more junior, like we are depending on them to do more asynchronous work than someone like myself who's constantly in cross collaboration meetings. So you kind of, I think to your question, you have to set very clear expectations and take a stance. It's not easy to like tell people like you're going to be expected to work in PST if you go abroad, but if you don't tell them, then you can't expect to hold them to it. You can't expect them to be in meetings if it's 10 p.m. their time, because you didn't set that. So really, I think the performance management was driven by redoing expectations, being very explicit, focusing on output, and then training managers to help them to take corrective action, or making sure they supported them if that was not the case, and having those hard conversations. In a lot of ways, going back to the basics, right? Like you had to do all these pre-pandemic, even if you were in person, but you have to like almost like re-emphasize that now with some minor tweaks to the approach.
Q, have you given us kind of the outline of what is corporate nomadism? And is there anything here that we've missed in what you define as corporate nomadism?
Yeah, so corporate nomadism is a word that I've kind of coined on my own, because I think that's kind of how I describe a lot of the work that's going on. To me, I think the only thing I'll call out is the evolution and rise of corporate nomadism, to me, happened at the start of the pandemic and through the pandemic. And really quickly, I'll try to explain what I mean. Pre-pandemic, a lot of the travel was business driven or personal driven. You went on a business trip to travel around the world, or you went on a holiday for a few weeks. If you went on a business trip that, your flights and hotels, for example, were paid by the company, you were subject to far less immigration and work authorization restrictions. Like I could go to Ireland tomorrow as a US citizen if I was going for work. If I went for pleasure, you get your tourism visas and you figure that out like everyone does. What happened through the pandemic and beyond was people were starting to travel for their own personal desire, and they would pay for their own trips, but they would do work. That right, wrong, and different regulations are way behind and not caught up for that. So what happens is that I, as a US citizen, cannot go to Ireland if I pay for my own trip and want to work out of an Airbnb there, because it's not a work sponsored trip and a tourism visa won't cut it. So I think that gave rise to what I refer to as corporate nomadism, because now all of a sudden employers have to focus on the compliance aspect, have to help their employees go, because saying don't go does not work in the long term. And saying go, but we're not going to look into it is not going to work long term either. So I think that gave rise in the corporate context of nomadism, because nomadism by itself is not new. It's been going on for a while, but I think it was more for the freelancer and gig worker previously. And now it's more for corporate employees as well, which is what I kind of refer to as corporate nomadism. And there's a bunch of myths that we try to do a lot of research on with published groups that have published data on things like, nomadism today is a lot of folks, 4 out of 5 people that are living the nomadic lifestyle are full-time employees. Majority of them are also high earners and over the age, and I think 2 or 3 out of 5 are over the ages of 30. So nomadism has grown to the corporate world today. It's encroached on that. So that's what I refer to as corporate nomadism in that context. And that's exactly like folks like Brett and others that are enabling that lifestyle, because you can't just say go live and work anywhere, but hey, your health insurance won't work when you go.
Exactly.
So it's kind of that's what I refer to it as.
So Q, we've come to that time in our podcast that we kind of diverge into a different direction, a more personal direction where, as somebody who's worked and lived in 10 or more countries, had broad exposures, a learned man, we ask, for you to share perhaps a overlooked person, place, or experience you would suggest for our listeners to discover.
Yeah, for me on a personal note, something that I seek out is a place with an experience everywhere I go is looking for a record store. And for me, it's just one of those, it's almost like looking for a bookstore. It's hard to find to really experience that in person. And B, I think it really, based on where you go, the country or the city, it really like brings together like what is top of mind in some ways, or what's, I don't know, famous is the right word, but what is more absorbed by that culture. And I often pick out like one completely like local record and bring it home. So for me, it's like record stores. I think it's an experience, it's a place. And it just opens your mind to just a lot. And they're hard to find. It's not easy. So I have to look for them and go seek them out whenever I travel, whenever I have the time. So that's what I would go with.
Q, you're a bit of a renaissance man. I love the record store idea, especially if it's local or regional type music. I've been very passionate about music my entire life, so that's a great recommendation. Being that you're as busy as you are these days, how would our audience find you? Are you out there on social media? Where can we get in touch with you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is a great way. Another way is also if you go to goliveandworkanywhere.com, it'll take you right to my website. So either goliveandworkanywhere.com or LinkedIn are the 2 best ways to get a hold of me.
Fantastic. We appreciate you joining us today. And Brett, I learned a lot. I'll throw it to you first on, as we like to tie things together. What did you learn today? And a couple ideas for our audience.
Well, Q, thank you for doing this podcast with us today. Yep. And in full disclosure, Q is on our advisory board at Insured Nomads, and we've been delighted to have him along on the journey and look forward to kind of where we take this in the fullness of time. His recommendations or pearls of wisdom on blocking time for async, I think is important. The second thing that I picked up on, because we are not currently doing this, is I lovingly refer to it as we're an omni-channel brand, meaning that we have Slack, SMS, WhatsApp, Teams, GChat, DM on LinkedIn, and then we have part of our team managing our social
and email too,
and email, which I find is kind of a dying platform, quite frankly, with all of the other existences out there. But I think the nugget that I'll take away is maybe we reevaluate that in the operations of Insured Nomads and pick 1 or 2 instead of all 50. But great to have you on, Q, and it's good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
And Brett, to that point, add also texts, phone calls, but also when you get used to a platform, companies tend to move to a new one. And then there are folks like me who have trouble catching up because I just learned the last one and we're now moving on to the next one. The other thing I learned today is I love the record store idea. When I travel overseas, I actually let what limited amount of hair I have grow long, and I get a haircut in different places and have great conversations and usually leave a really nice tip to show a little bit of American hospitality. And I've actually had people not want me to pay because America at some time did something nice for them, and then I'll just leave the money on the banister. But I do love the record store. I'm going to add that to the repertoire. So thank you for putting that with us today. So a great podcast, a great guest. I just want people to remember that the New Nomad is not just a podcast. This is a way of life, people's ideas and spirit working together to take advantage of that location-independent lifestyle. We want you to travel. We want you to feel excited about exploring the world. And thank you for joining us today. Please tell just one other person about our podcast. That's how people learn about this community. We look forward to hearing from you again. And once again, we thank our guest, Q, and we ask you all to please travel safely in the future. Thank you, and have a great day.
Insured Nomads proudly supports the New Nomad podcast. Insured Nomads for the evolution of insurance, for the revolution of travel. For all your travel, medical, and support needs, please visit our website at insurednomads.com. We support our location-independent community worldwide.
Thanks for tuning in to the New Nomad podcast, where we bring together an incredible community of people and ideas that embody the nomadic spirit. Please remember to subscribe and leave a review. For more amazing tips to help you take advantage of the cross-border lifestyle, please visit us at insurednomads.com/podcast. See you next week.